You are standing on a street in Riyadh. The light is perfect. Golden hour, the kind of light the photographers travel thousands of miles to capture. The sky is painted in amber and violet, the colors that have defined this channel's visual language, the palette of the desert at its most beautiful. You raise your camera, and a hand appears. Sometimes it belongs to a security guard, emerging from a booth you had not noticed. Sometimes it belongs to a police officer, materializing from a vehicle parked in shadows. Sometimes it belongs to a stranger, a concerned citizen who understands what you do not. The message is always the same. No photographs here. You lower your camera. You apologize. You move on, and you wonder, what is it about this particular building, this particular street, this particular angle that cannot be captured? What secret lives in the frame you are not allowed to take? This is a documentary about the places in Riyadh where cameras are not welcome. Not the obvious places. The military bases, the intelligence headquarters, the facilities that any nation would protect. Those restrictions are universal, understandable, unremarkable. This is about the other places. The buildings that look like office towers but cannot be photographed. The neighborhoods that appear on maps but disappear on Google Earth. The streets where tourists have been detained for capturing images that seemed, to them, entirely innocent. Riyadh is a city of contradictions. A city that wants to be seen by the world, that spends billions on events designed to attract global attention. That has opened its doors to tourists after decades of closure. And yet, there are corners of this city that remain invisible by design. Frames that cannot be captured. Images that do not exist because they are not permitted to exist. The question is not just what these places are. The question is what their invisibility tells us about the nature of the city itself. Every city has buildings that cannot be photographed. The White House in Washington has restrictions. The Kremlin in Moscow has zones where cameras are forbidden. MI6 headquarters in London has long been subject to informal photography bans. Though the building itself is hardly secret, TC's normal. This is expected. National security requires certain precautions, but Riyadh's restrictions extend beyond the obvious. There are buildings in the city, as financial district, glass towers that look like any other glass tower, where photography is prohibited. No signs explain why. No official statements clarify the restriction. The buildings simply exist in a category of their own, visible but not recordable. Some of these are government facilities. The Ministry of Interior, the General Intelligence Presidency, buildings whose functions justify caution. Others are more ambiguous, private office towers, housing companies, whose names appear in no directory, residential compounds whose inhabitants are not publicly identified, structures whose purpose seems commercial but whose protection seems governmental. The architecture of restriction follows its own logic. In some cases, the restriction is announced. Signs in Arabic and English declare that photography is prohibited. Guards enforce the rule visibly, their presence a constant reminder that this space is different. In other cases, the restriction is discovered only through violation. The tourist who raises a camera and finds himself surrounded. The journalist who captures an image and finds their equipment confiscated. The resident who has lived in the city for years and learns, suddenly, that a building they pass every day exists in a protected category they never knew existed. The boundaries are not always clear. A street may be photographed from one angle but not another. A building may appear in the background of one image, but not as the subject of a focused shot. The rules shift depending on who is watching. Voice asking who is deciding in that particular moment what constitutes a threat. This ambiguity is not accidental. When rules are unclear, caution becomes the default. When the boundaries of permission are undefined, people restrict themselves more than any explicit rule would require. The architecture of restriction includes not just the visible barriers, but the invisible ones. The self-censorship that uncertainty creates. Riyadh is a city where many people do not photograph freely, not because they have been told not to, but because they are not certain they are allowed. Open Google Earth. Navigate to Riyadh. Zoom in on the city center. The resolution is extraordinary. You can see cars in parking lots, shadows of palm trees, the patterns of tiles on rooftops. Now navigate to certain coordinates. The image changes. The crisp clarity gives way to blur. The smudged pixels that indicate deliberate, the digital fog that says, This place exists, but you cannot see it clearly. These blurred zones appear throughout Riyadh. Some are expected. The Al Yamama Palace, seat of royal power, is obscured. Military installations are hidden. Intelligence facilities are pixelated into abstraction. Others are more curious. Residential areas that seem, from their to be neighborhoods like any other, but whose satellite imagery has been degraded. Compounds whose walls are visible but whose interiors are digitally erased. Spaces that, on the ground, might appear entirely ordinary, but which someone has decided should not be visible from above. Google complies with these requests. The company has acknowledged that it obscures certain locations at the request of governments. The United States, Israel, India, Saudi Arabia. Many nations have areas that appear blurred on commercial satellite imagery. The practice is standard, the compliance routine, but the Saudi requests are notably extensive. Researchers who have studied Google Earth's blurred zones estimate that Riyadh has more obscured areas per square kilometer than most major cities. The reasons are not publicly explained. The specific buildings or facilities involved are not identified. The blur simply exists, a digital silence in the middle of a mapped world. What cannot be seen cannot be discussed. What cannot be captured cannot be shared. The blurred zones of Riyadh are not just restrictions on imagery. They are restrictions on knowledge itself, on the ability of ordinary people to see, to understand, to question what exists in the spaces that power has decided should remain hidden. The blur is a message, and the message is, this is not for you. The royal palaces of Riyadh define the city's geography of restriction. There are dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, depending on how one counts. The primary residences of senior royals, the guest palaces for visiting dignitaries, the historical palaces preserved as heritage sites, the new palaces under construction, rising from the desert with a speed that unlimited budgets allow. Each palace creates a zone of prohibition around itself. The perimeters vary. Some extend for hundreds of meters. Others encompass entire neighborhoods. The boundaries are not always marked. They are learned through experience, through warning, through the sudden appearance of security personnel who materialize when invisible lines are crossed. Photography near palaces is universally prohibited. This rule is enforced with varying degrees of intensity. Near the most sensitive locations, the residencies of the most senior royals, the enforcement is immediate and serious. Cameras are confiscated. Phones are checked. Questions are asked in rooms that tourists do not expect to enter. Near less sensitive locations, the enforcement may be a warning, a request to delete, a gesture toward departure, but the rule is constant. The palaces cannot be photographed. Their gates cannot be captured. Their walls cannot be framed. The vehicles that enter and exit cannot be documented. The faces of those who come and go cannot be recorded. This creates strange distortions in the city's visual record. Professional photographers working in Riyadh learn to orient themselves away from palace zones. Real estate images carefully crop out protected backgrounds. Tourist photographs show gaps, angles that would be natural but are not captured, views that would be obvious but do not exist. The palaces are visible. They are not secret. Everyone knows they exist, but they exist in a category beyond documentation. They can be seen with eyes, but not with lenses. They can be passed, but not captured. They are present, but unrecordable. This is a particular kind of power. The power to exist in plain sight while remaining officially invisible. The power to be known, but not documented. The power to occupy the city's most prominent spaces while leaving no trace in its visual archive. The palaces of Riyadh are not hidden. They are simply not permitted to be seen. Behind the restrictions lies an infrastructure. Riyadh is one of the most surveilled cities on Earth. Cameras watch intersections, entrances, public spaces. Facial recognition technology has been deployed at scale. Digital monitoring systems track communications with sophistication that few nations can match. The state sees everything, but the state does not wish to be seen in return. The facilities that house surveillance operations are among the most protected spaces in the city. The buildings where data is processed, where communications are monitored, where the digital lives of millions are analyzed. These buildings exist behind multiple layers of restriction. They do not appear on maps with accurate labels. Their functions are not publicly acknowledged. Their locations are known through inference, through leaked documents, through the testimony of those who have worked within and left. Photography near these facilities is not just prohibited, it is dangerous. Tourists who accidentally capture these buildings in their frames have found themselves in extended conversations with security services. Journalists who investigate have faced consequences ranging from deportation to detention. The protection of these spaces is absolute, the tolerance for violation minimal. This is, in one sense, understandable. Every nation protects its intelligence infrastructure. The NSA headquarters in Maryland is not open for photography tours. GCHQ in Britain maintains strict perimeter security. These restrictions are normal, but the extent of Saudi Arabia's security state and the corresponding extent of its visual restrictions exceeds what most visitors expect. The kingdom has invested heavily in domestic surveillance. The technologies deployed are cutting edge, the capabilities extensive. The systems that watch the population are themselves protected from being watched. There is a symmetry here. The state that sees all does not wish to be seen. The cameras that capture everything are themselves forbidden from being captured. The infrastructure of observation exists in a zone of invisibility. Its existence known, but its specifics protected. This creates a particular atmosphere. A sense that one is always being watched, but must never watch in return. A feeling that the city has eyes everywhere, but forbids you to point your own lens at its eyes. The security state's shadow falls across Riyadh, and in that shadow, photography is not merely restricted. It is reverse. Not all of Riyadh's invisible zones are sites of power. Some are sites of poverty. In the southern reaches of the city, neighborhoods exist that rarely appear in photographs, not because they are protected by security forces, but because their existence contradicts the image that Riyadh wishes to project. Labor camps housing thousands of workers, dense apartment blocks where migrants live in conditions that would not meet standards elsewhere. Streets where the infrastructure is older, less maintained, more revealing of inequalities that the city's promotional materials do not acknowledge. These areas are not formally restricted. There are no signs prohibiting photography. No guards emerge to prevent cameras from operating. The restriction is not legal but social. An understanding that these images are not wanted, that their capture and circulation serves no purpose, that power recognizes. Journalists who have photographed these areas have faced obstacles, not immediate dissension, as might happen near a palace, but questions about their purpose, scrutiny of their credentials, suggestions that other stories might be more appropriate, other angles more welcome. The soft pressure that shapes coverage without explicit censorship. The result is an archive with gaps. Search for images of Riyadh, and you will find the gleaming towers, the wide highways, the luxury malls, the architectural statements that the city wants the world to see. You will find far fewer images of the other Riyadh. The Riyadh, where workers from South Asia share rooms, designed for families. The Riyadh, where older buildings crumble while new ones rise nearby. The Riyadh where the gap between the kingdom's wealth and its workers' circumstances is visible in every frame. These neighborhoods exist. Millions of people live in them. They are as real as the kingdom center, as present as the financial district, as much a part of the city as any palace. But they exist in a kind of visual poverty, unseen, not because cameras are forbidden, but because cameras are not welcome. Hidden not by walls, but by the understanding that some images do not serve the story that Riyadh wishes to tell. The forbidden zones of Riyadh include places where power resides. They also include places where power is absent, and where that absence is itself something to be hidden. The restrictions extend beyond physical cameras. Social media has created new frontiers of visibility and new frontiers of control. In Riyadh, the posting of images is not always free. Content that would circulate without comment in other countries can attract attention here. Images that capture restricted areas, even accidentally, can be flagged, reported, removed. The platforms cooperate to varying degrees. Saudi Arabia has leveraged a large population of users, significant advertising revenue, the implicit threat of being blocked entirely in a major market. This leverage shapes the policies of companies whose headquarters are in Silicon Valley but whose users are global. Content moderation in the kingdom reflects local sensitivities. Images deemed inappropriate, whether for reasons of security, morality, or political sensitivity, can disappear without explanation. Accounts can be restricted. Users can find their content invisible to local audiences, while remaining visible elsewhere. The digital frontier is also the same technologies that monitor communications can monitor social media. Posts can be tracked to their authors. Images can be traced to their sources. The anonymity that users assume is often more fragile than they realize. This creates a chilling effect. Residents of Riyadh, both citizens and expatriates, learn to think before posting. They learn to consider not just whether an image is interesting, but whether it is safe. They learn that the distinction between public and private, between visible and hidden, extends into the digital realm. The tourists who visit and post freely may not understand this. They may share images that residents would never share. They may capture and upload content that locals would self-censor. They operate under different rules, different expectations, different understandings of risk. Sometimes this creates problems. Images posted by tourists have been used to identify locations that were not meant to be identified. Content shared innocently has revealed information that was meant to remain hidden. The visual openness of the visitor collides with the visual caution of the resident. The digital frontier is contested territory, a space where global platforms meet local restrictions, where the assumption of sharing meets the reality of surveillance, where the image that seems harmless may carry consequences its creator never imagined. In Riyadh, the forbidden frames include not just what cannot be photographed. They include what cannot be shared. Saudi Arabia opened to tourism in 2019. For the first time, visitors from around the world could obtain tourist visas, could travel freely within the kingdom, could experience a country that had been closed for decades. The opening was celebrated as a milestone in Vision 2030, a sign of the kingdom's transformation. Tourists arrived with cameras. They arrived with the habits formed in other countries. The assumption that public spaces could be photographed, that interesting buildings could be captured, that the visual documentation of travel was a right rather than a privilege. They learned otherwise. The stories accumulate in travel forums, in blog posts, and the warnings that experienced visitors share with newcomers. The tourist who photographed a government building and spent 8 hours answering questions. The traveler who captured a street scene that happened to include a security installation and had their phone confiscated and searched. The visitor who pointed a camera at what appeared to be an ordinary compound and discovered that it was not ordinary at all. These experiences are not universal. Many tourists photograph freely without incident. The restrictions are not total, not comprehensive, not applied equally to everyone at every moment. But they are real, and they shape the experience of visiting Riyadh in ways that distinguish it from other cities opening to global tourism. In Tokyo, you can photograph almost anything. In Paris, the camera is as welcome as the tourist who carries it. In New York, the visual documentation of the city is itself an industry, a culture, an expectation. In Riyadh, the camera is more complicated. It is permitted but not entirely free. It is welcome but not without conditions. It is a tool of tourism but also a potential instrument of violation, depending on where it is pointed and what it captures. Tourists learn to ask before shooting. They learn to read the environment for signs of restriction. They learn that the absence of a prohibition sign does not mean the absence of prohibition. They learn that the rules are not always written, that the boundaries are not always marked, that the permission they assume may not be the permission they have. This education is part of visiting Riyadh. It is a reminder that the city is opening on its own terms, at its own pace, according to its own definition of what visibility means. The tourists bring cameras. Riyadh teaches them where those cameras may and may not be pointed. What does it mean for a place to be invisible? Not physically invisible. The buildings exist. The streets can be walked. The spaces can be inhabited. But visually invisible. Unrecorded. Undocumented. Absent from the archive of images that defines how places are known and understood. This is a political question. Visibility is power. The ability to be seen, to be documented, to be recorded. This is not neutral. It shapes how places are understood, how events are remembered, how accountability is established or avoided. When a space cannot be photographed, it cannot be scrutinized. What happens there cannot be documented. Who enters and exits cannot be recorded. The activities that occur cannot be captured as evidence. The space exists outside the visual record, immune to the kind of examination that images enable. This is valuable to power. The ability to act without documentation is the ability to act without accountability. The ability to exist without images is the ability to exist without evidence. The ability to prohibit photography is, in some sense, the ability to prohibit witness. Riyadh's restrictions are not unique. Many cities have forbidden zones. Many governments protect sensitive locations. The impulse to control visibility is universal, but the extent of Riyadh's restrictions raises questions. Questions about what requires such protection. Questions about what would be revealed if the cameras were permitted. Questions about the relationship between visibility and power in a city that is simultaneously opening to the world and maintaining its spaces of invisibility. The kingdom wants to be seen. It has invested billions in events, in tourism, in the infrastructure of global attention. It has opened doors that were closed for decades. It has invited the world to witness its transformation. And yet, the forbidden frames persist. The blurred zones remain. The restrictions continue. The city that wants to be seen retains spaces that it does not permit to be captured. This is the contradiction at the heart of Riyadh's visual politics. A city reaching for global visibility while maintaining local invisibility. A nation opening to the world's cameras while forbidding those cameras from pointing in certain directions. A place that wants to be seen on its own terms, and only its own terms. The places you cannot photograph in Riyadh are not just locations. They are statements. Statements about what power wishes to hide, about what visibility is permitted and what is prohibited, about the boundaries between the Riyadh the world is invited to see and the Riyadh that exists behind the blur, beyond the restriction, outside the frame. The city glitters in the evening light. 1,000 glass towers reflecting the setting sun. 1,000,000 lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. The skyline that appears in every promotional video, every tourism campaign. Every image designed to show the world what Riyadh wants to be. Somewhere in the city, a tourist raises a camera. Somewhere else, a hand appears. No photographs here. The tourist lowers the camera, nods, moves on. They do not know what they almost captured. They know only that it was not allowed, and that not knowing that permanent uncertainty about what exists in the frame that was forbidden is itself a kind of knowledge. Knowledge about the nature of the city. Knowledge about the relationship between seeing and power. Knowledge about the invisible architecture that shapes what can be known and what must remain hidden. The places you cannot photograph in Riyadh will remain unphotographed. Their invisibility is not an accident. It is a choice. And that choice tells us something about the city that no permitted image ever could.